Hello, my name is Fergus McNeill. I work here at the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research at Glasgow University, as does my colleague Marguerite Schinkel. But we have a couple of guests in town, and we thought it was too good an opportunity to miss to have a conversation featuring all of us about life after punishment and whether or not it's possible in contemporary societies, particularly in the UK and in the USA. Maybe I should make clear, both Shad and Reuben hail from over there. So Reuben Miller is at the University of Chicago, and he is the author of the recent book, Halfway Home. Remind me of the subtitle?
Race, Punishment, and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration.
Okay, already a contemporary classic, one of my favourite books. A much older book, but equally distinguished, is Shad's Making Good, How Ex-Convicts Reform and Rebuild Their Lives, from 2001.
Yep.
And Shad's now at Queen's University in Belfast. And Marguerite Schinkel is here in Glasgow with the rest of the team. And you published in 2014 or 15, we think, Being Imprisoned. You had a subtitle too.
Ooh, but you thought of it. Rehabilitation, adaptation? No, I'm not sure.
Oh well, doesn't matter. There is a subtitle, you can look it up.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah, anyway. All three have published books which engage with questions around punishment and reintegration, how that's experienced, what effects it has, how it impacts on people, on their relationships, and in different ways, all, I think, of you, and in my own work, we've engaged with the question of life after punishment. So before we get into the substance of the conversation, we thought we would have a brief exchange to help us define our terms, Marguerite's idea. So we have to start with punishment, and I'll say what I meant when I posed you all the question, and then you can chip in if this needs clarification. So I'm thinking principally about state punishment, so punishment imposed through the criminal courts in response to criminalised wrongs. That's my kind of broad area. I think for the purposes of today's conversation, and this is maybe unusual for me, I'm also thinking principally about imprisonment or incarceration rather than other forms of state punishment like fines or community-based supervision, although obviously people coming out of prison are also often under supervision of one sort or another. So that's what I meant by punishment. Is that making sense? Mm-hmm. Everybody with me on that? And life, well, I think by life after punishment, I don't just mean staying alive, although that's not an insignificant achievement and an insignificant question, given what we know about mortality and morbidity for people leaving prisons, and how many of them die early and comparatively young. But rather I'm thinking about life in a broader sense of a satisfying or a fulfilling life, a life which is in some sense integrated within a society. Although we can debate what the precise meaning of that might be. So are we okay on those terms? Is that all making sense?
I think so. I think I do think that it's important to stretch the bounds of punishment, though. So, for example, like excluding community sanctions, I don't know.
Okay.
I might not exclude community sanctions.
Well, I'm never going to oppose including community sanctions, so that's absolutely fine. Let's do that. But the core question is: are people? Do people who are processed through institutions which administer state punishment, are they ever beyond that? Are they ever able to get past that? And if so, I guess under what circumstances? And I thought I'd start with you, Reuben. And we've identified kind of core concepts from everybody's work that we're just going to kind of throw around between us and compare notes across research projects in different continents and with different populations, which is kind of fun. But I wanted to start with vulnerability, because reading Halfway Home, one of the things which sticks out for me most is the way in which people experience a systemically induced form of vulnerability, which is particularly acute and powerfully felt and experienced. So could you start by sort of unpacking vulnerability in your work?
Sure. And I think this is one of the reasons why I'd be interested in thinking about what happens in community, and also just a more expansive view of punishment So the vulnerability, the state imposed vulnerability that shows up in my book comes from the legal apparatus on the one hand and then criminal stigma on the other. So you've got, on the one hand, in the United States, you've got 44,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that target people with criminal records. And what these do is they constrain their ability to fully participate in the political economy and culture. So for example, if you've been convicted of a violent offense in the United States, you may not live in the home with, say, a foster child, or you may not be in the home with a child who was adopted or something like that. If you've got a felony record at all, you may not live in public housing. You may not so much as visit someone who lives in public housing, or the person who lives in public housing could be evicted. And so on the one hand, these kinds of things fray family ties in, ridiculously harmful ways. And on the other hand, it produces a kind of precarity and a kind of vulnerability, and instability for sure. It produces a constant threat of additional harms that family members take on, that people with records take on. So you may not live in the home with a foster child. Mm-hmm. Well, in a state like the state where I was born, Illinois, the number one indicator, the variable that explained the most causal variable for foster care, the thing that made you most likely to be in foster care in the state of Illinois in the years that I was born, for example, was that you came from a black family. Mm-hmm. You came from a black family, and so not being able to be in the home with someone where there's a foster child impacts black families in particular in disproportionate ways. But to get to the point of vulnerability, I mean that's disproportionate harm. It's not quite the same thing. But if we think about vulnerability for a hot second, so then what does that do? So then the child is alone. The child is in the home without a father, mother, brother, sister, cousin, uncle. And they're left in many ways to fend for themselves. And the point about housing is an obvious one. You're vulnerable to all the things that exist outdoors, whatever that means. You're vulnerable to all the things that exist that come with housing instability, which has been shown through previous research, which includes additional bouts of incarceration, drug use, mental health issues, like all manner of the kinds of things that would, for example, shorten one's life. Yeah. You become vulnerable to as a matter of law and policy. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of my work in that area.
So what that's driving home to me is that it's not just the vulnerability of the individual who's been through the penal system. It's a kind of amplifying, concatenating vulnerability that reverberates through families and communities. But the other angle on it, which I'd like to hear a bit more about, maybe if I use a different term, the way in which people are then punished people are created as liabilities.
Absolutely.
For their families. Absolutely. And for the people that care about them.
Absolutely.
And the impact of that on relationships.
Absolutely. I mean, so what you have is you have a group that's made needy. So 44,000 laws, policies, and sanctions, mm-hmm. 19,000 employment restrictions for this group. 19,000. In the state of Illinois alone, there are 500. This is one state, and my state isn't particularly bad. I mean, I'm just using this as an example. So in one state, 500, that jumps up to 900 if you count constraints on access to business licenses and property rights. There's your entrepreneurship, for example. So 19,000 labor market restrictions means it's almost impossible to get a job that's beyond some sort of menial job, beyond being able to scratch out more than, say, a menial existence, yeah. Which of course is psychically debilitating. you know, your best effort will get you maybe manager at McDonald's if you're very lucky. And then you've got a family. And your family's looking to you for support, financial support, because that's what we say manhood is, for example. You know, or that's what we say a good family member does. Anyway, long story short, you become a liability on the one hand because you can't access work, you can't access housing, you can't participate civically in ways that you might find meaningful. Over 1,000 laws that limit civic participation. And on the other hand, you become an undesirable candidate for help because changes in liability law that began in the 1980s, which allow families to be punished if they help you. So if grandma lets the person with the record sleep on the couch, she can be evicted, for example. Yeah.
So,
can I ask something?
yeah.
Because how are people supposed to be aware of quite that many, you know, legislative kind of things? And so how often do they come up against them without knowing that they were there?
Yeah, it happens all the time. I mean, we see it. The largest case, the most popular cases are often around voting restrictions, for example. So in states like Texas, you know, I can give you 4 or 5 examples in the last 4 or 5 years of people who are on supervision who, for example, were given 5, 10, 20-year sentences for voting, who didn't know that they weren't able to vote, who thought because they had finished their supervision or something like that, that they would then be able to go out and vote. But there's some obscure law in the book somewhere that they didn't realize was in place. These, what we might call collateral consequences of criminal conviction. It could be that. It could be something a little more arcane. And they end up being arrested and locked up. I mean, a woman was literally locked up just a couple of years ago for 5 years for voting in the 2016. Oh no, there was a 2020 election. It was in the 2020 election in Texas specifically, who I'm thinking about. So you can't. One of the kinds of vulnerability that you have, I think precarity might be a word that we might want to think about. That you can't know from time to time or place to place what laws you're breaking or following. You know, like the legal landscape is almost impossible. It's almost it is undiscernible, and some of the things are unenforceable. So on top of the 44,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that everyone with a criminal record who comes out of the United States faces, you're also handed something called conditions of release when you walk out the prison door, that tell you things that places you must go or places that you can't. And one of those conditions, an unenforceable one, is you may not associate with known offenders. So in a city like my city, Chicago, in a neighborhood like mine, I live in a neighborhood called South Shore. It could be South Shore. It could be any one of the 7 out of 77 Chicago community areas that host over half of all the prisoners who get released into the city, that subsequently host half of all the prisoners that get released from the state. So this place where with a deep concentration of both incarceration and release, it is almost impossible to navigate that community without interacting with somebody with a criminal record. Yet, this is a condition of release. You can be arrested for this. Anyway.
So I want to kind of bring this to Scotland a little bit, because those numbers, like the 40,000 and the 19,000, are so mind-boggling that we might think couldn't possibly be like that here. And maybe it isn't in terms of legislative requirements and restrictions. But on the other hand, just to give you a concrete example, last week I was visiting somebody in Barlinnie who's serving a life sentence, who's been released. He's now on his 2nd recall. Part of the grounds of his recall to custody on his life sentence was that he's caught on CCTV using a pub toilet. And there's a condition that you can't go into licensed premises on parole, but he has a job in a licensed premises. And he's allowed to work there by his supervisor.
But not use the toilet.
But not use it. Well, maybe he can in the workplace, but not when he's passing a pub and he doesn't. He's caught short in the middle of town. So that's precarity of another sort, where it's not the volume of restrictions, it's the interpretation of the meaning of restrictions being complex. But I wanted to turn to you, Marguerite, and ask you more generally, in your work, you've done 2 studies, one of long-term prisoners' experiences of imprisonment and release, and one working with and following people who served repeated short sentences. And I wondered to what extent similar themes of vulnerability, precarity, and being a liability to people that love you Do those themes also surface in your work, or in different ways, or to different extents?
Well, like you've already just said, like it is in different ways because we don't have the long list of, of laws against you, basically. And I think people are more aware of the ways in which the world is against them. I think in Scotland and in the UK more broadly, getting work with any kind of criminal record is very difficult because employers can always ask, and they do always ask. So you have to disclose your convictions, and then you have very little chance of getting the kind of jobs that you're most likely going for, which tend to be also the more menial jobs, but those jobs can be filled by anybody. So, you end up. So what I'm finding is that both those people who had served long-term sentences were sometimes quite optimistic about the future, but when they were, so I didn't follow people, so I talked to people after they released, and they were different from the people I spoke to in prison. But even the people who were released and had been released for a long time sometimes weren't living the kind of full life that you were describing. Very few were, and that was partly, I think, because of institutionalization. So like just finding it's really hard to be outside after a long time in prison, and being fully open to family and friends again and not shutting themselves away. But also because it was so difficult to achieve any of the things that they were looking forward to in prison, especially in relation to employment. I mean, this was only men I was speaking to, that they were kind of just giving up and becoming quite hopeless and kind of questioning the point of it all and all the effort that maybe they'd put into. Some of them had really put quite a lot of effort in, going to college, doing different things, and kind of what was the point of it all, I'm not really sure.
One thing you two could interestingly compare notes on, which you mentioned briefly, the masculinity angle, or the denial of the opportunity or the capacity to provide, and therefore to fulfil a kind of a particular gender or gendered role. I don't know to what extent in your work you've also seen, I don't know how to describe it, frustrated masculinities or something like that as a feature.
And it has also had direct impact on family life. So if you're living with your partner and maybe your children after you've been to prison, so you've rejoined them, but you can't find a job, that affects benefits badly for the whole family. And so people have been asked to move out of that house so that the partner gets the full benefits again, for example, right? And because they are expected to be that breadwinner, and people will have patience potentially for a certain length of time, but then they feel like you should be pulling your weight. But if you can't find a way to do that,
and even if you know intellectually that those barriers exist, in a relationship you still reach the limit of your maybe I'm overgeneralizing here, but I can see the limits of tolerance would come into play. So let me move on to another concept, and this is going to sound terrible, Marguerite, but it's a concept I associate particularly with your work, which is hopelessness. So you've written both on your own and also with Brice Nugent in a 2016 paper on the pains of desistance about frustration, goal failure, and the production of hopelessness. So can you just maybe start by saying about how hopelessness is produced for people cycling through the penal system?
So for that group, I think what is interesting is that within prison, at the end of a long sentence, people have usually made as much of a life as they can for themselves within that environment. They're not, they're comparing themselves to other prisoners and they're doing well. They might have a good job that they enjoy in the prison, and people actually said that. Like, in prison, I always have a job. Then you come outside, and your family might be happy with your progress in prison as well. But then when you come out and you can't reach any of the goals you've set for yourself and that other people see for you, and you are then comparing yourself to other people your age, maybe people who you knew before you went to prison, and they've moved on with their lives, then suddenly it's quite bleak. And then just because the way that, well, like I said, how people are employed in Scotland or not employed in this case, and because of the effects of institutionalization, it's really hard then to have that kind of full, meaningful life. But in my other research with people who go in and out of prison repeatedly, it's maybe even bleaker in that there's never that much hope in the first place. And they're never maybe in that space either, right? So like they don't come from a place where they feel like they have a meaningful making a contribution to society, often a lot of drug addictions. And then they go in and out of prison to the point where they might prefer to be in prison, or there's just nothing out there for people anymore.
So there's, for people who are institutionalized either through long sentences or through repeated sentences, there is a way of living inside the system and inside the institutions which is denied outside. I mean, I'm not suggesting that the life inside the institution is desirable, but just that it's made possible in a certain sense, whereas life outside continues to be impossible while these barriers, which might be legal or might be social, persist. So I'm going to make a connection, Chad, to your work, because in the Liverpool Desistance Study, which is the study that you write about in Making Good, one of the things which sort of surfaces in that book, among many things, is the theme of hope and hopefulness. And you did other work, I know, with Ros Burnett and colleagues on the role of hope in desistance. So maybe give us the flip side. What are the sources of hope? How is hope enabled and sustained in spite of some of the kind of structural and cultural barriers that we've been talking, and legal barriers that we've been talking about so far?
Yeah. So, I remember when I first wrote about hope, that concept, it was openly mocked by some of my colleagues. I remember the truly great criminologist Neil Shover sort of singing a song about faith, hope, and charity or something like this, and that there's a sense we have of hope as a kind of empty, fluffy concept. I sometimes picture the let them eat cake. Well, let them have hope at least. This is this sort of frivolous thing you could put on posters around a prison. Hope, and these sort of things. And that, of course, isn't what I meant. But it's interesting as the test of time has shown, suddenly people, many of whom were very skeptical of that concept when Roz and I and in my previous work wrote about that, suddenly hope has become quite a familiar concept in criminology around desistance in particular, and it's one that resonates very well with those inside, even those working in. I remember once a prison governor came up to me after a talk and said, my talk didn't go down terribly well. There was others that were much better targeted to the audience, but she said to me, your take on, I think I had a slide about abandon hope, all ye who enter here. She said that blew me away in that that is what we do in prisons is try to remove hope, and she said it was just such an important concept to her. So what is hope? How do you get it? You don't get it through kind of this neoliberal pull up your bootstraps. You don't get it from a lecture from a cognitive behavioral therapist or anything else. Hope is something that true hope anyway comes about through actual change. When we see this measurement, the correlation between hope and desistance, it's not saying that it's all in someone's head. It's saying those who have hope are the most likely to desist. Well, the reason they have hope is a sociologist, Snyder, describes hope as the will and the ways. Both you've got the desire to want to change and the vision for what you want to do, but you also have the wherewithal to realize that vision. You could think of real hope versus empty hope. Empty hope is I really hope the world is better when I get out. Real hope is I know where I'm going. I know who's going to be there. I know the plan I've got in place, and it's that kind of hope that is so powerful in desistance, and it's a rare thing because so much of what we do, and we've already talked about, undermines that sense of hope, and it's a deeply difficult thing to achieve when you're in these situations.
Yeah, I'm also really struck by, I'll mention, we have a PhD researcher at the centre here in Glasgow, Sarah Kennedy McKean, who's just finished a PhD which looks at hope in processes of resistance, drawing on theology and criminology. And there's lots that could be said about that. I mean, like, one of the fascinating things she's taught me from the theology side is that lots of theologians write about hope as a vice, which I hadn't grasped, for reasons that maybe not appropriate to go into here, but just interesting. But she also discovers in her through her research that hope is often, not always, but often profoundly relational. So we have hope either because of people around us who project hope for us, or who are, or in whom we invest our hope, which kind of connects back to the vulnerabilities, liabilities, precarity discussion. So if your relational resources for sustaining hope are stripped or made fragile by the dynamics that Reuben and Marguerite have been discussing, then we're also basically depriving people of the resources and relations that might be generative of hope, or might sustain it. Do you, going back to you two, because we started off with a very kind of negative, or focusing on some of the most negative aspects of your analyses and findings, but is there hope? I mean, do you have stories of hope or of achievement, of progression in spite of all of the dynamics that we started with? So where are the hopeful stories in your work, I guess, is the question.
I think in spite and because of, you know. So I'm thinking a lot about, you know, one of the takeaways shared from your book for me is, you know, people being able to see themselves in a different way, and being, which you know, I mean, this conversation about will and ways, it's specific. You know, they can see themselves slotted into a set of different kinds of relations. Yeah. So it's not individual at all. It's social, and it's material. It's what I do with other people, and those folks tend to do better. Okay, so in that way, I find the folks I follow to be, you know, representative of a full range of humanity, and therefore there are folks who have really shallow interpretations of what's happening around them, and there are folks that have really incredible, profound, deep analysis of what's happening around them. And those folks, some of those folks on both ends tend to go into a kind of resistance or activism. They push back against the things that happen around them. And some of those folks learn to survive, you know, this point about finding a life for yourself on the inside. Knowing full well what the structural constraints and limitations are, both on the inside or the outside. And so what I see is people responding to the conditions that they live in, folks who are better at projecting, you know, both themselves into new sorts of social situations, and folks who are able to project or imagine new social situations, you know, like in light of the struggle or something like that, also, you know, go about making great change. So there are a million stories of, for example, formerly incarcerated activists, the role of the jailhouse lawyer, for example. I mean, you don't get any of the prison litigation in the 1970s forward in the United States, which is sort of fundamental, sort of orienting and re-articulating constitutional rights for everybody in the U.S. In fact, there are books on the powerful and important relationship between like prison organizing a couple decades before and the emergence of things like civil rights, you know, this kind of thing, sort of at least in the United States. And so you get great social change that emerges from this group. And within this group, there's always the jailhouse lawyer. There's always the old head. There's always the community soups. You know, that's on the inside. You know, people getting together to figure out how to make jailhouse pizza or something like that. You feel me? Like that's gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's a dynamic expression of social life that people have made and found for themselves. And then on the outside, you know, people have been able to hold on to and maintain relationships across bouts of incarceration, which is hard to do and striking, but people are able to do it. They figure out how to do it, and I think it's because of how they understand themselves within the systems that they're made to navigate. That's what I think.
Marguerite?
It's a very interesting, almost a counterpoint, because with the long-term prisoners that I've spoken to and that we know, sometimes you do get people who turn into PhD students and really kind of draw on extraordinary capacity and kind of within themselves to be able to do that. But with the people who are going in and out of prison, it's almost like, I don't want to say the opposite, but it's almost a happenstance, kind of really lucky confluence of things coming together. But as Shad said, it's very rare. So like Sarah Anderson, who was at Napier University, her research, she actually found that more people die in the period of her field work than actually reach that kind of confluence of all those factors. Just to, bring the hopelessness back in. Shouldn't laugh. But I do, so in my latest research, I followed people over a couple of years, and one of the people who I thought was most emblematic of the way that kind of imprisonment shreds your life and shreds your self-image and shreds your confidence, went from telling quite tall stories about being a gangster and having all this benefit from offending to having only been out 2 days before he went joyriding last time since he was in prison, and being very hopeless. And then he got in touch, so this is not part of my official research, but he got in touch to say that he's actually doing really well and met a partner and life is looking good by email, and we had a little conversation. So it's never a given, I don't think, like it's never determined, but it is, I would say it is very rare in current social arrangements and the way that we deal with offending, that people are actually able to do the time and then be finished with it. They often say, I've done the crime, I have to do the time. But we don't let that be it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would like to say, like, this is powerful, interesting. I totally agree with it. I don't think you ever do the time, like, and that's it. I don't think you ever move on. I think that people find lives, like this is, at least from my work, this is what I see. It's never that, people find any real, some people find a sense of freedom, but that, it's, in the States at least, we're talking about legal constraints, so it's not like that goes away all of a sudden, it doesn't happen differently because you feel different about yourself. Somebody's like, right, like this. The real structural limitations to what people are able to do, and people do die prematurely, and which was just a powerful statement, by the way. Like, that was just powerful, and I believe that's absolutely right. And it bears out, at least in the data that I've collected. But I think the thing it's not a but, it's an and. And people also figure out how to live together in their own way, whether that be like, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Some people withdraw completely, and that's that. I didn't find that most people are withdrawn. I found that most people connect with a family of some sort and create some sort of form of something that they're, and I think it's important to tune into whatever that dynamic is. Like what is the Saidiya Hartman writes about the dynamic lives that women specifically are able to, especially queer, radical, like black queer women are able to find for themselves amidst what she writes about as the enclosure. So, things are pressing in on all sides. And people are finding love and experiencing social life. They're finding and making pleasure and joy in their own ways. They do die prematurely, for sure. It's not a story of optimism at the end of the day. It's not a story of all things working out together. It's like okay, but what is the social life like in the midst of this thing, which is something I just want to highlight.
I want to come back maybe to the theme of time and temporalities and prison time or post-prison time. Something I want to go into on that towards the end. But before we get there, I want to kind of flip to another concept which is connected. So I think what you've just been describing is actually a kind of generativity also. Like, generativity is associated with your work, Shad. So maybe you could explain the concept first, and then I'll ask you the question I want to ask about generativity. So tell us what it is first of all.
Right. Well, generativity comes out of Erik Erikson's stage model of human development. I was a student of human development, was my PhD, and most students of human development focus on early childhood because, as anyone who's a parent knows, unbelievable changes happen at unbelievable rates in those childhood years, and we know from a lot of research how important those years are for development. The second most interesting area is adolescence, and there's huge changes that happen in adolescence, and then sort of third is old age and gerontology and what happens at the end of life. We do very little in human development and beyond in sort of changes in adulthood, so adult development. And one of the few scholars that's looked at that is Erik Erikson. And I think, you know, and that's where my interests are. You know, sometimes we talk about this as emerging adulthood, sort of the transition into adulthood, but it's really changes that go beyond the kind of the classic transition that we think of from adolescence to adulthood. That you know, when you go from youth to a man or a woman, there's changes that happen beyond that, and as you know, using Reuben's phrase, these aren't just individual changes. So when Erikson talks about generativity, it's not like puberty that's a biological change. It's a social, normative. It's expectations. It's role based, and so it's a much more collective process that happens during adulthood, and it doesn't happen naturally or organically, and some people, due to things like criminal justice, probably no institution thwarts generativity better than the justice system. I guess I should define. You asked me to define it, and I'm skipping ahead. What generativity is the need. I like to think of it as a need. Someone think of it as a desire. The process of giving, of generating, of growing, of producing. So the young adult. We were talking about masculinity. The young male's performance of masculinity is one of heroism. It's one of being the soldier, the warrior, the showing that they're a man, showing that they can be brave, maybe violent, maybe all those things that I no longer am, a vibrant youth, and to prove one's virility. The older individual, masculinity changes, and we talked about being a provider, as you know, giving something to one's family, to one's community, and these kind of things. Well, the criminal justice system is largely founded around policing of those warriors, of young males performing masculinity in that way, that it's normative, and we wanted, you know, lots of middle class white children are also acting out those things on the hockey pitch or the rugby field and these sort of things. You know, they too know that's the aim of the game, to attract mates and to be heroic at 18 and 19 years old. But they that being socially acceptable forms of violence and performance have no trouble then transitioning later into generativity, whereas the young street warrior who finds himself or herself in many cases incarcerated gets stuck in that sort of developmental stage and isn't given the opportunity to be generative. And one of the things that came out in my research was this need, this desperation to prove to find roles and ways to be generative. And as Reuben talked about, there's so many restrictions on one's ability to do these things, to engage in what we would think of as completely normal things, you know, earning a living, providing for your family, playing a role. You know, you can't be a teacher, you can't be a coach, you can't be all the things that we expect of older heads if you've got a criminal record and these kind of things, and so it's an interesting and underutilized concept in sort of thinking about assistance in criminal justice.
So interesting, and so interesting to hear these concepts and findings sort of hitting each other almost as the opposites. So you put me in mind of, since we're in Glasgow University, this just always pops into my head, but we had a rector famously here, a communist called Jimmy Reid in the 1970s, he was a trade unionist who led a sit-in at the Clyde in the shipyards. And when he was the rector at Glasgow University, he gave the rectorial address on alienation. And he was speaking at the kind of moment of deindustrialization of this city and talking about the social and psychic damage that deindustrialization was doing, particularly to men of working age in this city at that time. And it springs to mind here as a denial of generativity, which is also like the production of precarity and of moving from being an asset to your family and your community to being a liability to them, all of those opposites and oppositions. So I guess, again, to keep us away from a council of despair, let's think a bit more about generativity and where we find it and where it exists. So something I've learned in recent years from the work that we've done in the Distant Voices project is that generativity comes in lots of different forms. Sometimes generativity is family related or work related, and those are the kind of two dominant social institutions where we think about it. But it's also fundamentally to do with making stuff, right? And creativity is making stuff. And even decorative forms of creativity are fundamentally human. And I think what I've witnessed in that project and what I've experienced in that project indeed is that it's dignifying, fundamentally dignifying to be a maker of things and to be recognised as a maker of things. The value that's put on the things maybe matters, but it's subjective, especially in the field of songwriting, which is my kind of mode of generativity in that project, and that's the creative method that we've worked through. But can we think of other examples? I mean, what was interesting about your jailhouse lawyers and the PhD researchers from prison is that that's a kind of generativity which is often collectivized and politicized and part of either incipient or well-developed social movements. So any other kind of generativity insights that we can sort of glean from the comparisons here between the projects?
I mean, my guys, one of the main ways that they're able to, many of them, that they're able to provide for themselves and their families is through care work. And so this isn't, I mean, it is creative, but not in the same way. I mean, they're not making art, you know, they're making a quote difference or something like that, or they're like giving back, or you know, that and it's one of the few places where having a record is a positive qualification. Now the problem is it rests on a set of presumptions. There's an incredible ceiling. There's the problem of a kind of circularity that I don't think we think carefully enough about. You know, for example, for the way out of the misery of, you know, mass incarceration is to dig deeper into your past or something like that, and to pull from this wellspring of knowledge that you've gained from your misery to never really get out of the circle of misery. It's an incredibly bleak, you know, awful thing on one hand, and on the other, folks who have been accused of, who have admitted to committing harms, I find, and I think probably all of us, I don't want to speak for us, but I think I've seen it in our work, you know, where the desire to give back is a real thing, and that's often through like mentorship, through spending time with children, this kind of thing.
Giving back is one way to put it. I also think a lot of it's paying forward. Like there's a sort of the transaction isn't retrospective after all. It's more kind of what are we going to do with this and where are we going to take it. But to pick you up on the point about care work versus artwork, actually, I think the connection between the two is craft, and craft has roots in experience and practice, right? So it kind of it makes art seem less highfalutin if we talk about craft, at least to my ear. But I think there's incredible craft in care, peer care, and family care, and all sorts of care.
They're also both about giving, and they're both about recognition of that giving. It's whereas crime is only crime in the sense of the community has decided that this person has done something wrong to us. The type of work that you can call paying forward or giving back. It's socially recognized as a value to the community. People will thank you for all you've done to help my Jimmy or to what you've done for this community and these kind of things. So there is that reflected value that's also really crucial for desistance and identity change. Yeah.
Interesting. I would say that in the people that I spoke to, it was mostly caring for parents who themselves hadn't cared for the person themselves.
Wow.
So like often mothers or fathers. So the care was still within that really small circle, but parents were aging, and so they were looking after that person, and that was to some extent generative to them at least, right? But not recognized by other people. Did give them a reason to be out and to stay out of prison. But was more almost still about repairing or still about gaining the love of somebody or things like that.
It's also interesting that in the care work, at least as this relates to men, the age-graded development of masculinity that you were speaking about, Shad, means that masculinity is playing out in a new way, which might be partly a product of constraints. That we're not allowed to go out and be industrial labourers with heavy equipment being macho, but we can look after the baby or we can look after the elderly parent now. That's interesting as well, like to the extent to which people can and do adapt to that, maybe even embrace it. I don't know if that...
I think our theories of masculinity aren't capturing what's happening. That's what I think. I think the hypermasculine, independent, emotionally absent view has never quite captured the lives of people who are marginalized from the broader political economy. Who've always had to engage in some form of care work. There's always a story. If you talk to any of the cats who we follow in jails or prisons, they'll always have a story about an uncle who took them to work, for example, it's our vision of care work, our vision of masculinity doesn't allow for it. Also, like the kinds of care that you see on the inside, pushes against the view of the prison as only a space of violence and isolation, and it's just our social theory is it's been a little too wooden.
We need David Maguire, don't we, for this conversation, for sure.
Definitely.
But no, I think that's such a great point, and it also makes sense of what I've experienced, which is, when you run a songwriting workshop in a prison, it's definitely not a hyper-masculine space. There's quite often right at the beginning you'll get a little bit of performed masculinity of a certain sort, but over the course of 2 or 3 days, the kind of masculinity that's playing out there is not what people would assume, I think, typically happens in closed institutions of that nature. Okay, I've got 2 concepts to finish with, and we might just pick between them, or we might do both and just keep going for a bit longer. So one is about time and temporalities, and I'm partly being selfish here because I've just written a paper about time after time, so the kind of doing time when you come out thing. And the other is hospitality, which was my kind of attempt to balance our 2 negative and 2 positive concepts crudely. Maybe we could try and do both quite briefly. So if we start with hospitality, Reuben, I know you've recently done a TED talk on radical hospitality, which I think, if I'm remembering it rightly, because I watched a while back, is kind of challenging us in relation to how we might do differently in response to crime and punishment. Yeah, maybe you could just say a bit about that and direct us to where that TED Talk is, or how to search for it. Is it just under your name? And
yeah, if you just do my name in a TED Talk, it should pop up. But the Reuben Miller, but so one of my dear friends now, a guy I used to work with who was a part of my research team his name is Ronald Simpson Bay, and he's a brilliant, fantastic man. And Ronald did 27 years for a crime he didn't commit, and while he was on the inside, his son was murdered by a boy. So his son, who was a man, was murdered by a 14-year-old. And what Ronald does is Ronald advocates for the murderer, the kid who murdered his son, and he advocates that he be tried as a juvenile instead of an adult. And so this is in the state of Michigan, where many people were tried as juvenile. He led the country in this for a while, and led and sentence length and everything else. And so this, had the child been tried as an adult, he would have had no life. He would have stayed in prison, probably for life, as have many people before. And so I asked him why he did it, and he told me he did it because it was the right thing to do. He told me he did it because, harming the kid wouldn't have brought back his son. He did it because of his ethical commitment. I asked him if he loved the boy. He told me no. He didn't love the boy. Of course he didn't. How could you? I mean, in some Hollywood movie, some sentimental movie, this is possible. But in most people's lives, the capacity to love someone who's harmed you in that way just isn't there. I asked him, did you forgive the boy? And he said yes, eventually, but that wasn't how it went down at first. Forgiveness can be a platitude. Forgiveness without works is dead. So it's really a question of like what Ronald did, and what Ronald did was he did his best to ensure that the boy had a place in the world. And this to me is the point of, what I'm calling, other people have talked about radical, what I view as a kind of radical form of hospitality, which is a commitment to the other so the other has a place.
Yeah.
And that place isn't without its problems. Like the boy did juvenile detention. You know what I mean? He did not do juvenile prison. He did, but he was able to take on a life, to find work and make his own decisions from that point. Yeah. Now Ronald is done. He doesn't have to do anything else. He doesn't have to invite him into his home. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have to love him. They don't have to exchange cards and do birthday parties together or dinners. He doesn't have to be on a sentimental level, nothing at all. But the question of, do you have a place in the world or not? Like that's it. And what I think, at least in the U.S. context, and I think in Scotland too, for sure, and all across the world, is what we've done is we've made it so that people who've caused us harm don't have a place. And a fundamental challenge, at least for me, is figuring out what's the place for the person who's caused harm. That's the ethical question, because it's really the question of what kind of world I want at the end of the day. So that for me is the hospitality.
Yeah, no, that's, powerful and also very evocative of the moment we live in, right? Because I think we're, at the time of recording this, we're 8 or 9 days into the Ukraine conflict, war, whatever we want to call it, and the little glimmers of hope in that I find when I'm endlessly doom scrolling in social media is like yesterday I found a picture of pushchairs for toddlers, like little kids' chairs, that people had dropped off at railway stations and left, where refugees from Ukraine were going to arrive, and they were going to arrive carrying their children in their arms, and people had thought they're going to need pushchairs, so we're going to put our pushchairs at the place of their arrival, and that's maybe the cost of that is not the cost that Ronald's faced, but nonetheless it's another act which basically says you have a place, and I'm going to do something, whatever it is I can do, to open that door, figuratively. And yeah, I could talk endlessly about hospitality in the context of Distant Voices and the way in which the community building dynamics of that project, as well as the creative dynamics, are all about creating places temporary and enduring, through all sorts of practices of recognition. And I guess recognition is also implicit in that story, because Ronald's recognition of his son's murderer as a boy.
As a boy.
Yeah.
As a human being.
Yeah, who should have a future.
I appreciate just to push this a little bit too. Like I just so appreciate this point. Like the point of recognition. Think about the malopticon sticks in my head, of course, right? To be misrecognized or to be recognized badly, right? And that's murderer does that. You know, murderer does that. It jumps right in front. You know, the criminal is an omni-relevant category, and so it subsumes everything else. You know, it might be conflated with race in the UK and in the United States, and we see that through arrest records, stop and frisk records, prison records, etc. You know, the likelihood, I joked when we hung out, on the one hand, I could get easily, you know, I'm fighting a cold, which is why I'm sniffling right now, and so sorry, Margaret. So you know, I try to stay a little distant, and so I took a COVID test to make sure I could have it, and the fact that I could just go to the pharmacy and they hand me 7 COVID tests with no question is a kind of hospitality toward one to another. And then I take my COVID test and I walk to my very nice hotel. It's a very nice hotel I'm staying at, and nobody wants to get in the elevator with me. You know what I mean? So like, right, like this moment of recognition. Okay. Anyway, the point I'm trying to raise is the recognition piece. So race might be conflated with criminality in interesting ways. You know, the women in my hotel who don't want to jump on the elevator because they're afraid I'm gonna beat them over the head or steal their purse. And that follows. That's here. That's in London. That's in Paris. That's certainly in the United States. Like, I'm not pretending like it's anything different. It's not at all. Right? Like, it is the same. You know, their response to my 6'3" son is the same across places. So that's there. And race might be conflated with criminality, but criminality still, but that difference, that othering, that distance that gets produced in that moment is the thing that is recognized, is the thing that is transmitted from institution to institution, from person to person. Yeah. And so Ronald had to reach around it. Yeah. You know, which is to me, you know, I'm talking too much, especially for a 40-minute segment, which to me is like that's the powerful and hard work. What happens when I reach around this thing? Yeah. The harm is to me. It's not to some abstract thing over there. The harm has been caused to me. How do I reach around that thing and figure out how to create a place for? How to recognize properly. And what's proper recognition? It is as human being. Human being who's caused harm, not murderer, say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm also quite interested in how that plays out on a community level, so not directly to the victim, but also that misrecognition for much less serious offenses. So I'm talking about people go to prison forever for repeated shoplifting, for example. And then the fact that they have been in prison so many times makes them completely misrecognized from the fact that they have also been harmed in lots of ways, not least by the state, right? Yeah. So we are hoping to do this project on very local places and seeing how do people move away from harm rather than from offending. So that's harm to other people, but also harm to themselves. And what can you do on a local level to make that more likely so that becomes more welcoming and more hospitable?
Yeah, I can't add much. I love Ronald's story, and I've heard you tell it a number of times, and what I love about your framing of it is that it wasn't about, you know, we're not asking the impossible of human beings. We're not saying we have to love everyone and accept, you know, he didn't adopt the 14-year-old, but that he saw him as human. And to me, again, if my role in this is as a developmentalist, to see someone as human is to see them as an organic, changing, evolving creature that says this 14-year-old has done something unbelievably awful, but he's not always going to be that same person that we know from our own 14-year-old selves. I mean, none of us would ever want to be held responsible for the things we did at 14 for the rest of our lives, and in particular to be stuck in that moment by a justice system. So all the legislation the two of you have talked about presumes a kind of permanence of a stain of evil, of criminality, of whatever it is that isn't human, because it's not dynamic, it's not changing, it's not organic, and when in terms of my research on community opinions about crime and justice, the people who were the most forgiving, the most hospitable, perhaps, were those who, when they thought about offending, they immediately thought about, well, that was just like my brother when he was 16, or my cousin, or in fact, this reminds me of me. You're seeing themselves and knowing that actually they turned out all right, and that it's probably something that's going on in that person's life, but that could be changed, and it is not something forever to be associated with that person. Yeah.
Just, it strikes me that, we live in, maybe I don't want to exaggerate this, because I think it's attitudes and sensibilities on these questions are actually very complicated and contradictory, or at least they can pull in different directions. But it's almost as if hostility rather than hospitality is what we're invited to feel and socialized into feeling in response. And the binary, the victim-offender binary is a key device for triggering sympathy or the opposite of sympathy. So the creation of hostility makes it actually even suspect to offer hospitality to somebody who has done that wrong, at least in a certain sort of sense. So yeah, it's such a powerful story. It's probably a good place to end, but I'm going to just maybe as a way of summing up, I'm going to say a little bit about this temporality question, and then if you guys want to all have a last word on that, we'll finish at that point. So,
I was thinking it would also be nice to talk about life after punishment in the societal kind of how do we get,
cool.
rather than sticking with the punishment, because obviously we've all agreed to some extent that punishment creates a problem.
That's a great idea, and maybe let's if I do the little bit about temporality, that might be a connection to that rather than the other thing. That's fine. So, long story short, it's a paper from the Distant Voices project called Time After Time, where we're trying to extend the thinking about what we understand about prison time to post-release and re-entry. And we talk about 3 travails or struggles or work of doing time after time. And I'm not going to talk about all 3 of them, but the one which most resonates with this conversation is one that we call enduring temporariness. So the travail of enduring temporariness, which we mean it's a play on words, right? So people are compelled to endure temporariness because they never achieve the security of belonging and acceptance and hospitality and all of those things. But it's also something that they are then, temporariness is then something that they're compelled to endure. And for some people it's not endurable. So the paper ends with the story of somebody that was part of our project who died by suicide, and the clues that he left in his writing were about the fact that temporariness is not endurable, and so, or for him, it wasn't endurable. He couldn't find a way, as we were talking about, some people finding a way to resist, or a way to collectivize, or a way to survive. So, obviously then, the answer, we've already had the answer, right? Ronald's the answer. The answer to ending the problem of temporariness and insecurity and being a liability and being made vulnerable and not being allowed to be generative is hospitality, right? Is it as simple as that? Is it that we need to say, okay, you've done something wrong, but however we respond to that, it has to be a way that gives you a place and that recognizes your worth as a person. Can we take that further or elaborate in any way?
Also qualifying the idea that you've done something, because people change, like when rather than seeing people as static.
Yeah, so, but I hear that, and I hear the kind of critical criminologist on my shoulder saying, you concede too much by talking about the individualized wrong. What about the social context? What about the what about the criminogenic inequalities that drive people into actions which they are then compelled to own as an individual, as if that's fair? And obviously I agree with that critique, and yet I wouldn't say it to Ronald's face, in relation to his his loss. If he makes that analysis himself, that's a different question. But point accepted. But beyond that, there's still harm, real harm, that's happening to real people in relation to crime that needs some kind of response, some kind of accountability.
Just to put in one more critical terminology bit, but like we all commit harms, and I mean this point gets made again and again, but like I think somebody in America said, well, it's really easy to imagine a world without police and without prisons because all the middle class neighborhoods are like that, right? People are committing insurance fraud, tax evasion, all kinds of things, cheat on people, do personal harms as well. And they're not defined as crime. And so, and we don't need the police and the prisons to solve that. Maybe police and prisons make things worse.
Well, we might need other forms of regulation that do respond to those harms, and that don't just let them slide. So I still want to hold to accountability, although I completely agree that that there are profound inequalities in the ways in which we target certain behaviours for criminalisation and others for, I don't know what the word is, acquiescence, celebration. Sometimes certain forms of middle class offending, like tax evasion, is like, oh God, how clever, how well done to evade that.
Right.
But to kind of hold it to the beyond punishment then, or after punishment, if we're asking the question about life after punishment as a society, what does it look like? What are the mechanisms of accountability that that make room for those kind of structural critiques, but still provide accountability and redress and, I don't know, censure maybe when that's required, but which open pathways to hospitality and a place and recognition for someone who's committed a wrong?
So I don't know yet. I mean, I think two things. I think the thing I appreciate most about the abolitionist critique is the positive project of building new things. And I think the thing that we need is a commitment. I mean, there's the commitment to hospitality, but that requires vulnerability on our part. And I think what we've tried to do is do justice in such a way that we distance ourselves from harm. And I think this is a part of the reason why, for example, hostility calls to us in the moment. Shad said something to me at a conference we were at the last time we connected, which was about being, I'm going to paraphrase, but you were saying, I think we need to really think about what we do with retribution. You know what I mean? Like, yes, like hostility calls to us. And it calls to, it is useful to us because we think that it protects us, it makes us less vulnerable. And so we make these people vulnerable so that we can be invulnerable. There is no invulnerability. All the moves we've made have made the world more violent, more harmful, have produced more problems, have created more problems than they've solved. Every move, mass incarceration. If I think about my own context in the United States, has caused more harm. Has caused more harms than it's resolved. Has resolved no harms probably, and it's caused more harms than it's resolved. And I think that might be the case. And I think there's a kind of courage that we need. And I think the commitment to hospitality is a commitment to vulnerability. So if I take it as far as, where it goes, where I think it originates, to invite someone to my home, I'm not saying invite people into your, that's not exactly what I'm saying. But if I take that, I'm asleep with this dude in my house. Right? Like I am on the hook here, but it's the only way. It's the only way to build, I think a just system.
either we're all vulnerable and we all accept a degree of insecurity with it, or we all live behind walls and deny ourselves connections, I guess. Yeah. Anything you guys want to add to that?
I thought that was very well said.
A very good way to end.
He is the man to end these things.
Okay. Well, then let that be the final word. Well, listen, thanks so much for coming to Glasgow, you two, and for coming along today from all of 50 yards away. Much appreciated. I think it's been a really rich and fascinating conversation, which despite its despite the apparent intractability of some of the things that we've talked about, does leave me with some sense of possibility at least. I'm not sure I'll use the word hope yet, but we'll see. But thanks again.
Thank you.
Cheers.
It's been great.